Well, the beauty of nature, the beauty of the forest, the sound of the birds. So many things that we'll be discussing today are things that you have observed in nature that perhaps made you even fall in love with the subject of biology and nature. So guys, we will be talking about all these organisms that you are familiar with. Finally, organisms you see on a regular basis, including amphibians, which make a beautiful chorus of nature in the spring especially, reptiles, and birds. So we'll be going through all these groups. We'll even talk about some extinct organisms in these various groups. So guys, let's go ahead and get into our slide 20 here and maybe get up to as far as slide 43. We'll kind of see how things go. So we are now beginning the group known as the tetrapods. So here in chapter 34 we're talking about vertebrates. We've just finished discussing the fish, and we've already talked about lampreys and hagfish and all, so we are ready to get into the tetrapods, which are gnathostomes with 4 limbs. So that would include amphibians, it would include reptiles, birds, and mammals. Now, of course, there are some tetrapods like snakes that don't really have 4 limbs. Snakes are considered tetrapods. Most biologists believe they lost their 4 limbs, so they did have them at one time. So anything that's an amphibian, a reptile, a bird, or a mammal, even if they don't even have legs like a snake, are considered tetrapods. So why would we have seen the development of appendages? You know, we're getting past the fish now. We just finished talking about the fish. So if we're looking at evolutionary history, we think the first vertebrates were fish, and then these fish began to transition to the land, and this of course would involve adaptations for locomotion on the land, reproduction on the land, and to of course prevent desiccation. So the 4 limbs would have been an adaptation to deal with the lack of buoyancy on the land. You see in the water, your body's supported by the water's buoyancy, so you feel lighter, right? You can probably pick up someone who's much heavier than you and carry them around if you're inside of a pool, but you couldn't do that on land. And so we need to have adaptations to help them stay up under the force of gravity. Sturdy lobe-finned fishes became animals with 4 limbs. So most people believe that something like a lungfish would have evolved into the first tetrapod. We'll actually look at one called Tiktaalik rosier, which is a possible transitional species from fish to tetrapod to amphibian. The vertebral column would have been strengthened, so we would have seen that vertebral column strengthened to help support the back underneath the weight of gravity. Hip and shoulder bones would have become braced against the backbone to provide a lot more support. This would also allow the muscles to develop a lot more in these limbs. So hip and shoulder bones are bracing against the backbone, providing extra strength against this strong vertebral column. And there were some relatively simple changes in gene expression to facilitate all this. So how could we have gone from something like a fish to something like a tetrapod with hip and shoulder bones braced against the backbone and vertebral column becoming strengthened? How could that have possibly resulted? Well, we think that Hox genes probably were modified. So relatively simple changes could have been modified. For example, Hox genes 9 through 13 work together to specify limb formation from the proximal, which is close to the body, to the distal direction, which is far away from the body. And these small changes in just a few of these genes could have resulted in some pretty radical changes, and limbs would have developed relatively easily. So let's move on to slide 21 to show you just how easy that may have been. Here on slide 21, you have Hox gene 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And 9, of course, codes for the scapula, which is your shoulder bone. Then humerus is the bone that would be sort of like connecting where your shoulder is to your elbow. And then your forearm would be like your radius and ulna, some of the carpals. Then down at the base of your hand, you have your carpals. And then you have, which is really your wrist bones. And then metacarpals would have been more in the middle of your hand, and the phalanges are actually your fingers. So Hox genes 9 through 13 work together to specify limb formation from the proximal to the distal point of the body, and it would have been relatively few changes, some modifications to these genes that could have allowed fins to eventually become loby, like your lobe fin fishes with muscles in the fins, and then that could have, then probably a relatively small jump could have transitioned into the limbs. But, you know, still there would have been a lot of necessary mutations, lots of necessary change. I don't want to make it sound like it's just a simple little mutation, all of a sudden you have a leg. That's not what we're trying to say here. It just wouldn't be quite as complicated as you might think. All right, so let's look at some transitional forms. If, in fact, fish really evolved into amphibians, where is the proof? All right, well, one example is Tiktaalik rosier, the fishapod. Why is it called a fishapod? Well, it had a very broad skull. The eyes were on the top of the head, which is an amphibian trait, lungs, which is an amphibian trait, pectoral fins, which is a fish-like trait, and 5 finger-like bones, which is more of an amphibian trait. So it had both, as you can see down here, it had both amphibian and fish-like traits. It was truly an amphibian is what we classify it as. So we see this organism would have fed on the land, but still very much tied to water for reproduction. You see the eggs are released out of this sort of like a cloaca, kind of a general opening, and those eggs had to be released into water. See, these eggs, guys, can dry out. As you probably know, amphibian eggs, such as frog eggs, which I'm sure you've seen in a pond before, do dry out. They are not shielded by a shell. They don't have that protective layer. They will desiccate. And so all amphibians, including Tiktaalik rosier and these early vertebrates that were starting to invade the land, would have all been tied to the water for reproduction. And it wouldn't be until the amniotic egg that we would gain some independence from the water. And the amniotic egg is not going to show up until we hit the reptiles. So around 320 million years ago, K-cops, which was very similar to amphibians, began to show up. And actually, guys, this picture is really K-cops here. The fishapod did have the eyes on the top of the head. If I could sketch the fishapod, it would have been kind of like this. So let's see here. I was thinking that they were talking about the fishapod. They'd have a picture of it immediately, but it was the K-cops. So K-cops is a true amphibian, showing up again around 320. But the Tiktaalik, the fishapod, would have been before that. So let's put the little eyes on top of the head like this. So it's been kind of an odd-looking organism here. There we go. Okay, so we're starting to see the fishapod, very broad skull. They had these pectoral fins like this, so it would have looked kind of fish-like. And then you would have had something like a tail like that. So something like this is what the fishapod looked like. Again, kind of a transition between amphibian and fish. And it would have been fish to amphibian. And why? Does anybody know? What would have really, I guess, put the pressure on the fish to leave the water? I mean, the water's a great place, right? You got all the water you need. You don't have to worry about desiccation. You got plenty of food. Why would you have wanted to get onto the land? We had no land-dwelling vertebrates until this time period. So why, stay in the water? Well, and why want to go onto the land? If the land is so harsh, right? Land is dry. You have more extremes in temperature. The sun, right? You more UV exposure. Land is harsh. So why would you left the water for the land? Well, you probably guessed it right. It's because of competition. The oceans were getting very crowded. The competition level was very high. And the land offered lots of food. Once land plants invaded the land around 500 million years ago, and once they covered the surface of the terrestrial portion of Earth, then that would have provided shelter. It would have provided moisture. It would have provided them for lots of food. And so there was a drive to get out of the ocean to avoid competition, to seek food, to seek more habitat. And that was probably what drove them to invade the land. Okay, guys, so let's go ahead and move on now to the next slide. Let's look at Davis and colleagues' providing a genetic developmental explanation for the limb length in tetrapods. So what Davis and colleagues discovered was that specific Hox genes are responsible for determining limb formation in mice. Kind of a weird, fairly cruel experiment if you think about what they did. They actually induced mutations in the genes HOXA11, HOXD11, which resulted in the loss of the radius, which is part of the forearm, the ulna, which is also part of the forearm, and the carpals, which are wrist bones. So they induced mutations in these genes, and these poor mice lost their forearms and even wrist bones. So they're completely developmentally compromised. And they discovered that very simple mutations can control relatively large changes in development. Like, for example, just messing around with two genes, HOXA11 and HOXD11, they were able to almost completely remove most of the arm, especially the forearm and wrist bones in these mice. Again, yeah, kind of cruel, but very, necessary to understand limb development from genes. So you can see here are the mice, and they were heterozygous for both genes. They crossed them, and you get all these different combinations of mice offspring. Got a double mutant down here. Some are just single mutants, and some are not mutants at all, like at the top there. And you could see they would measure the length of the bones of the forearm. And you could see the radius here. This is the ulna. These are carpals here, guys. And, of course, this is the humerus right here. This would be your scapula. Okay? So let's go ahead and see some of the further results. And here in the results page, in this table, you can see you've got in the mutants here, like here, where we have two little A's, we have two little D's. These are definitely mutants. And you can see lots of fusions where we have different bones being fused to others, resulting in very large changes in limb development. Again, especially with these that have two little A's and two little D's, which would be true mutants, single mutants in this case. But nevertheless, they discovered that it doesn't take a huge amount of change in these Hox genes to result in pretty radical changes in limb development. So there's some evidence that these things may have in fact happened, right, guys? So let's move on to slide 26. Okay, now let's look at our first big group of tetrapods, the amphibians. Does anybody know what amphibian means? Yeah, amphibian actually means hypocrite, all right? And these are hypocritical organisms. Why? Because they live in the water and the land in most cases. Some of them stay in the water their whole lives. Some of them stay mostly on the land. But most of the time they spend a very good portion of their life in both water and land. They must return to water to reproduce. This is their big dependency. Does anybody remember why the amphibians must return to the water to reproduce? Right, it has to do with their eggs, right? They have these eggs that can desiccate. These eggs are surrounded by a gelatinous matrix, like a gel that keeps them moist for a while, but they don't have a shell. They don't have all those wonderful things the amniotic egg will offer, as we'll see in future slides. So they have to come back to the water to reproduce. They just haven't declared complete independence from the water. But as adults, they are very terrestrially adapted. Now they also have this buccal pumping, something that characterizes the amphibians. This forces air in the lungs. You see, guys, they don't have a diaphragm, which is that breathing muscle that we have and that mammals and birds and a lot of reptiles have. They have on the floor of their mouth a flexible skin membrane, and it sticks out like if you watched a frog breathe. You see the bottom of the throat, the floor of the mouth expand. This puts air in through the nostrils, and then the throat tissue there, the membrane, rises, and that forces air out. So in and out by the raising and the lowering of the bottom portion of the mouth. That, folks, is called buccal pumping. And it doesn't allow for a very deep breath, but it does allow air in and out of the lungs. Now, along with the lungs, they can absorb oxygen through their skin. Now, their skin has to stay moist, though, and the skin can't be too warty. So in the case of toads, toads don't absorb a lot of oxygen through their skin. They're going to get more of their oxygen from their lungs, although they can get some oxygen from their skin. Frogs are much better at absorbing oxygen through their skin. In fact, when you do the frog dissection in a few weeks, guys, you'll see that there are lots of vessels, veins and arteries all throughout the skin, which are there to absorb the oxygen and then to deliver that oxygen to the rest of their body. So they're going to be, you'll see the lungs of most amphibians aren't terribly developed. When you do your frog dissection, you'll see the lungs are very small relative to the body because the skin is doing a lot of the work as well. Now, we see a step up now. We have a 3-chambered heart. Does anybody remember how many chambers did the fish have? That's right, there were only 2. And there was just an atrium and a ventricle. Well, now we have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. And so now we take the first atrium, or let's say the right atrium, receives blood from the body. It's deoxygenated. Then the blood goes into the common ventricle, and the blood then goes off to the lungs and picks up oxygen, and then it goes then to the rest of the body, or it goes back to the heart at the left atrium, and then back to the common ventricle, and then back to the body. So there's not a great separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, but at least we have 2 different chambers in the atria. So one atrium receives blood from the lungs, one atrium receives blood from the body. The ventricle shoots blood out to both locations. We'll see with a 4-chambered heart, we'll have something called double circulation where oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is completely separated. Fertilization is external, so eggs are released outside the body, then the male releases sperm on top of the eggs. So large numbers of eggs have to be produced because the sperm may not make it to the eggs. And of course, eggs can easily dry out, which is why they must have a moist season or a place to lay their eggs, like a pond or more, at least a puddle that's around long enough for those tadpoles to develop. The larval stages are aquatic. So again, like tadpoles, they are completely aquatic. They do use a lot of gas exchange through the skin, so they use their skin mainly for respiration. Although they will have gills in the larval stages in many cases. What's kind of cool too is the larval stage doesn't usually eat the same food as the adult. Like the tadpole usually eats dead plant material like decaying leaves, whereas the adult feeds on insects. So this does what, guys? Yeah, this reduces competition. Metamorphosis is regulated by the thyroid gland. So there is a thyroid gland like we see in other tetrapod groups that can either cause metabolism to be faster or slower. So this is the first group we've seen the thyroid gland develop. You could see now that we looked at the general features of amphibians, now let's look at some of the orders. So we have order Anura. These are frogs and toads. 90% of amphibians are in this group. So most amphibians are either frogs or toads. They're a very successful body plan with extremely strong hind legs. So the forelegs are fairly strong, but those hind legs are really powerful. They can jump many times their height. It's like the equivalent of a human being jumping 30 feet in the air. So they're very, very strong. They're very carnivorous adults. They are basically predators. So your frogs, your toads, they look kind of cute, but they are definitely out to attack. They are killing machines, especially the bullfrog. Huge mouth, 2 different kinds of teeth, ready to ambush prey, even attacking things as big as birds and mice. They have, of course, the herbivorous larvae, as I mentioned. So we see reduction in competition. The offspring do not eat the same food as the adults, and so we have less competition. That's the anurans. Again, frogs are more tied to the water than our toads. Toads have thicker skin. Toads also are typically capable of producing toxins in glands called bufonid glands. The bufonid glands produce a toxin. If something grabs onto the toad, it'll usually get a foamy mouth or sick. You've probably seen your dog maybe attack a toad before and get a really foamy mouth. Looks like your dog has rabies, but he may have just tried to bite a toad. So toads typically produce toxins in their warty skin. Frogs and toads do not cause warts, by the way. Warts are caused by a virus that's spread from hand-to-hand contact as people shake hands, etc. So we can't blame frogs and toads on the warts on our hands, guys. Yes. So frogs are much more aquatic, again, thinner skin, and frogs don't usually produce toxins, although there are many exceptions, like the poison arrow frog, which produces a very potent toxin in South America. The next group, order Caudata. Caudata literally means the tailed ones. So these are the salamanders who have very long tails. Salamanders are pretty neat. They have this thing called paedomorphosis, which the adult can often hang on to their larval characteristics. So some salamanders start out as in the larval stage, like every amphibian would, but they hang on to their gills, and they often have external gills, which they will retain even as adults. So some of them don't quite make the transition from larva to adult stage. That makes this group kind of unique. Salamanders also have an internal like fertilization. It's not totally internal. Basically, the male has this little packet of sperm, like in a little case, and then the female aligns her cloaca up and picks up that little packet of sperm. The sperm can remain in her cloaca for an extended period. We have a great deal of salamander diversity here in western North Carolina. There are a lot of salamanders that are only found in this area and nowhere else. So you'll see some of the salamanders' names named after some of the local mountains, like you might find, say, like the Brown Mountain salamander, and that's a salamander only found at like Brown Mountain. I'm just giving you an example of that. That's not truly the case. Real example would be like the green salamander is found in an area right by the highlands, and it's only found in that area. So you'll find very indigenous species, really interesting, lots of isolation, and so this creates, a lot of cases, very separate species. So Caudata salamanders, again, also carnivores. They are eating things, attacking insects, etc. These are not plant eaters. All right, moving on to Gymnophiona. This is a group you probably have never heard of. They're called the Caecilians, or some people pronounce it the Sicilians. And the Sicilians are nearly blind tropical burrowers. So we don't have them in this area. They're found mainly in South America. They look like worms. They probably had legs before, and they lost them. They actually have uterine milk they produce inside the mother's body. Very strange. They typically give birth to live young, and then they have this uterine milk. So they're very unusual. Again, basically blind since they live down in the ground. They don't have to see very well. And they, too, are insect eaters as well. So let's look at some pictures of some of these really neat guys. You can see over here we have the gelatinous mass of amphibian eggs. Again, these eggs can be desiccated despite the gelatin layer that can prevent some desiccation, but if the pond dries out, these eggs will not survive. This develops into the tadpole. Again, this is an herbivore feeding on mainly dead plant material. And then finally we get to the adult, or this tadpole becoming an adult. It starts to switch its diet and begins to develop those very powerful hind legs. Moving on to the next slide, you can see the tree frog. Really neat adaptations in the appendages here, especially in the fingers. Allows them to grab onto leaves and limbs. You can see the very smooth skin, very wet skin for gas exchange. Again, typical of a frog. The Sicilians down here, again, no eyes, producing this uterine milk, giving birth to live young. Kind of unusual. Even has an internal fertilization typically. So fertilization is internal, which is kind of unusual. So when it comes to reproduction, the Sicilians are very advanced compared to their other members of this particular group, the amphibians. And this is a salamander. Again, salamanders have this sort of side-to-side wagging motion to get around, very moist skin. Some salamanders, as I said, retain the gills as adults. Some of them develop lungs as adults. And many salamanders, guys, have lost both lungs and gills and only exchange gases through the skin. So the skin is the respiratory organ for a lot of them. Okay? All right, so there are your different amphibian groups. Now let's start talking about the amniotes. So the amniotes would include reptiles, birds, and mammals. Tetrapods with desiccation-resistant eggs. And mammals are even included in this group because we do have mammals that do produce eggs that are dry resistant or desiccation resistant eggs. So a major critical innovation was the development of the shelled egg. This will shelter the embryo from desiccation conditions on the land and form a physical barrier to protect the embryo. So we are now breaking the tie to water. No longer do we have to have water sitting around for reproduction. We can actually now occupy places like deserts. And so we'll see that there are not a lot of amphibians in the desert, but there are a lot of reptiles in the desert. Thanks to the development of the amniotic egg, this results in, of course, a huge explosion of species according to most biologists. You can see now some of the basic anatomy of the amniotic egg. So what makes the egg so special? Well, let's start off on the outside. You have a shell. The shell, guys, you may not know this, is porous. So oxygen can come in, CO2 can escape. So there's a nice gas exchange. But it also is very water resistant. It's more leathery in reptiles. It's more brittle in birds. The allantois would be another area that you want to pay attention to. This contains waste from the embryo. Of course, it gets bigger with age as the wastes are produced at higher rates. As the embryo develops, the sac gets bigger. Then we have the albumin, the egg albumin. That is almost all protein, guys. That's the white part of the egg. Very nutritious for the embryo. The embryo will need lots of protein. Then below that you have the chorion. This is with the allantois, allows for gas exchange. So we have to have gas exchange through the chorion, and we also have to have gas exchange through the allantois, which is where the wastes are again. Then you have the yolk sac. This encloses a reserve of nutrients, especially fats, which are very good at storing large amounts of energy. We'll also find some proteins and some carbs there too. Of course, that gets smaller with age. The yolk itself, again, is the very fatty material within the yolk sac. That's why the yolk sac has all these nutrients inside. The amnion protects the embryo in the amniotic cavity. So when you get pretty close to the embryo, you finally hit the amnion, which is going to hold lots of moisture up against the body of the embryo. Of course, there's the embryo, there's the actual cavity surrounding the embryo. So we have this nurturing environment where we have water, we have baby food, everything is there. Membranes for gas exchange. It's very much like the seed, guys, that we talked about with the seed plants. It's the equivalent of a seed. So this really allows many groups to now live in the desiccation conditions of the land. Other key innovations, though, on top of the amniotic egg to deal with the lack of water is desiccation-resistant skin. So now we finally get to skin that's going to be very dry. So when you touch a reptile's skin, it's going to be very dry. It doesn't have to be wet. The whole reason the amphibian skin has to be wet is to facilitate gas exchange. Well, we don't have to worry about gas exchange through the skin because we have very good lungs. And the lungs use something called thoracic breathing, where we have a diaphragm or something similar to that that creates a negative pressure within the lungs that allows large amounts of air to come in and out of the lungs. It's much more efficient than buccal pumping, which doesn't get nearly as much air in and out of the lungs. We have water-conserving kidneys. Kidneys concentrate waste prior to elimination. So I don't know if you realize that, but your kidneys have a whole lot to do with regulating the amount of moisture or the water levels inside of your body. So your kidneys can conserve water when you're becoming dehydrated. They can actually reabsorb water. Really neat. You look at the physiology of the kidney, especially if you take A&P, you'll see how that works. So when we urinate, our wastes have actually already been very much concentrated thanks to the action of the kidneys. Some organisms like kangaroo rats have incredibly water-conserving kidneys, incredibly powerful water-conserving kidneys that can really concentrate the urine and allow them to retain all the water they can in the desert, so they can go without water for days on end. Internal fertilization, again, pretty much universal. So amphibians, we have external mainly, with the exception of the Sicilians. And then we move on to this group here, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, which all have internal fertilization. Traditional classification breaks it down in these three groups, but now we are throwing birds in with a reptilian lineage. So we believe that birds are simply evolved reptiles. That's the new thing, I guess, or the relatively new idea. Okay, so these are all key innovations that will allow the amniotes to invade the land and be successful. Okay, let's now look at some of the different reptile groups. So one of the first reptilian groups we're going to look at here is testudines. Class testudines include turtles, tortoises, and terrapins. You know, tortoises are the land-dwelling turtles. Terrapins are aquatic. Now there are some differences that you'll see. Which one of these two do you think has the more prominent shell, or a shell that sticks up higher, more vertical? Yeah, that's the tortoise. The terrapins have a more streamlined shell, as you can see here with this green turtle, which is a marine turtle, a sea turtle, and you can see the shell is much more lower. It doesn't stick up very high. That's to do what? That's right. That's to make them more hydrodynamic. So you see the shell is much more streamlined in the terrapins. There's a couple other things too. The terrapins have flippers. Most people believe those are modified legs, whereas the tortoises have true legs with claws typically. They're virtually unchanged for about 200 million years. We don't think the body plan of the turtle has changed a whole lot, so it's obviously been pretty successful. Thanks to the hard protective shell, they can avoid predators. Most predators don't even try to consume a turtle. Sometimes they will, especially if they're desperate, but they don't often go after turtles, especially as adults. Most of the mortality that occurs with a turtle happens when they're young, as the shell is still not fully formed. So we see a lot of babies being killed, but if they can get to adulthood, they can live a very long time. Like a box turtle can live to be over 100 years old, guys. Isn't that amazing? Box turtles are pretty cool, guys. That's the turtle you'll probably bump into most often. So you can look at a box turtle. You can look at the scutes, which are the little sections on the top of the shell, like you can see here in the terrapin. It's very pronounced in the box turtle. And you can count the number of rings within one scute, and you can actually determine the age of the turtle. So next time you catch a box turtle, count the rings in the scutes and see how old they are. You'll be surprised how old some of the ones. I found one on my property a couple years ago that was 65 years old. So it had been walking around since the 1940s or 30s. I forget how many years ago it was, but it's just pretty cool. So some of them live over 150 years, like the alligator snapping turtle. They found some alligator snapping turtles not many years ago that had Civil War balls, like bullets, inside of them. So there was a battle, and some of the stray bullets hit some of the snapping turtles along the banks of the river, and then they found some snapping turtles not that long ago at all. Like, again, it's probably in the past 5 or 10 years. They actually found Civil War balls inside. So we know those turtles must have been over 150 years old. Pretty awesome. And most of the vertebrae and the ribs are fused to the shell. So if you remove the shell, you kill the turtle. All right. So they don't have the option of leaving their shell. The vertebrae and ribs are literally fused to the shell. So you are actually ripping out their spinal cord and spinal column if you were to remove the shell. They do lack teeth, but they make up for it with a very sharp beak. And they use that sharp beak to feed on, say it's fish for a turtle. They also can feed on all kinds of vegetation. They're typically more omnivorous. So guys, turtles usually eat all kinds of different things, like box turtles will eat slugs, but they'll also eat mushrooms and even vegetation. So they'll eat lots of different materials. Of course, conservation is a huge issue when it comes to these guys. Many of the nesting sites of the terrapins especially are being removed because of development of hotels and beach houses along the beachfront. Very few areas are designated for nesting sites for these turtles. So it's a big conservation problem. The number of sea turtles has really come down. Some are endangered, as you probably know. I think actually all sea turtles are actually on the endangered species list, or they're very much threatened, whereas some of the tortoises are, but not nearly as much as we see with the sea turtles. And again, that's because sea turtles have to lay eggs on the beach, makes them vulnerable. We're having a lot of development on the beach for recreational purposes. Also, there's all kinds of poaching. There's a lack of regulation as well. Okay, let's move on to Lepidosauria, not everybody's favorite group. This literally means scaly lizard, scaly lizard. So these include lizards and snakes. So pretty diverse group here, very successful. They have a kinetic skull with extremely mobile joints. So guys, you can see as this snake is consuming the frog here, you can see the mouth is opened very wide. That's because within the skull there are actually joints within the skull that allow the skull to become flexible, to allow them to eat very large prey, like things that you just normally could imagine actually fitting inside their mouth, like you see here. This frog here looks a lot bigger than the snake, doesn't it, guys? But yet the snake is able to eat it thanks to the kinetic skull with very movable joints. Some of them can actually unhinge their jawbone to really open the mouth even wider. So lizards versus snakes, well, lizards have movable eyelids and external ears, while snakes do not. So the most distinguishing trait, if you really want to distinguish between a lizard and a snake, is the movable eyelids. Most of you would say, Mr. Spath, you know, it would be the limbs, right? I mean, that'd be the easiest way to tell the difference between a snake and a lizard. But guys, there are legless lizards. Yes, legless lizards. So that you can't even use the limbs as a definite indication. You have to look to see, are the eyelids movable? If they are movable, that's a lizard. If not, it's a snake. External ears are typically found in lizards as well. Some lizards are venomous. This is the Gila monster, found in the southwest U.S., and it is in fact venomous. So don't assume that lizards are not venomous and snakes are. There are exceptions, guys. The only venomous snakes in this area, by the way, is the copperhead and the timber rattlesnake. I hear reports of water moccasins and others occasionally, but the official two poison snakes in this area are only two, the timber rattler and the copperhead. I encourage you to get familiar with the way they look. I'm sure most of you know what a copperhead looks like. The timber rattler is the only rattler in the area, so you know those are the only ones you have to be especially concerned about. The rest are non-venomous, which is not bad. I lived in Texas where we had a lot more venomous snakes there, so we're pretty blessed. Moving on to crocodilia. The crocodilians, these are a little different. Some of the other reptile groups, they're considered kind of like the most advanced because they actually care for their young. Unlike the other groups we just looked at, the lepidosaurians, you know, your lizards and snakes don't care a whole lot for their young at all. You don't see that much among turtles. The mother lays the eggs and she just leaves. So this group is really different. They also are different in that they have a four-chambered heart. So now they can separate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Their teeth are actually in sockets, which is different than what we saw, say, like with sharks and some of the fish we'd studied. This group includes crocodiles, alligators, gavels, caimans. There's lots of different types in this group. And we believe they have not changed a whole lot for about 200 million years. If you look at the fossil record, look at the ancient alligator species, Sarcosuchus. Sarcosuchus has a very similar body plan, as do the very similar body plan to the compared to the modern species. So we don't think that their bodies have changed a whole lot. Gavels have a very thin snout, if you're wondering, and they eat mainly fish. Caimans are pretty small in size, and they have a broader snout. But how do you determine the difference between a crocodile and an alligator? Well, guys, look down here. An alligator, usually you can only see the top teeth. So look right here. You can see the alligator typically just has the top teeth showing. Maybe a little bit of the bottom, but mainly just top. Whereas the crocodile, you see the bottom teeth and the top teeth going back and forth. You see, guys, bottom and top teeth. And how about the snout? Yeah, the crocodile usually has a more narrow snout. The alligator has a more broad snout. The American alligator is the big one in this area, though there is an American crocodile in Florida, just in Florida, whereas the American alligator ranges all throughout the southeast United States, including coastal areas of North Carolina. And then you'll also find in the other parts of the world, you'll find some really big crocodiles like the Nile crocodile and some of the saltwater crocodiles. They're very big as well, some getting up to over 20 feet in length. So 20 feet and a little bit over that is about as long as most of them get. Whereas Sarcosuchus, the ancient alligator, got to be closer to 50 feet. Wow, yeah, it's pretty scary. So we see this care for the young in the crocodilians. And because of the care for the young, the four-chambered heart, we definitely see a connection between the crocodilians and the birds. So we believe that what's most closely related to crocodilians are actually birds. So lizards are not actually as closely related to alligators and crocodiles as you might think. So look out for those kind of trick questions on the test. Birds are definitely the most closely related based on these traits. Even some genetic information suggests that they are more closely related to birds than they are to lizards, which again, looking at them, you might think crocodiles are more related to lizards. All right, moving on to dinosaurs. This is probably a group you have been fascinated by. We have the ornithischians, which are the bird-hipped dinosaurs. So which one would that be down here? That would be something like the Stegosaurus. Ornithischians were typically what? Carnivores or herbivores? That's right, they're typically herbivores. And do they walk on 2 legs or 4 legs? That's right, they typically walk around on 4 legs. So the big herbivores like Brachiosaurus, Stegosaurus, Iguanodon, a lot of these groups would have been your bird-hipped dinosaurs. Again, those large herbivorous dinosaurs walk around on 4 legs. And then we have the Saurischians. These are the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and some people also refer to this group as the theropods. Very similar grouping here, but the Saurischians, lizard-hipped dinosaurs, would be things like the carnivorous T-Rex. So walking around on 2 legs, very carnivorous, fast and powerful, big jaws, sometimes reduced forelimbs. Another one would be Spinosaurus. Another one would be Velociraptor. We also saw other Saurischians, including, let's see, there's Velociraptor, there's Spinosaurus, T-Rex, Gulgosaurus is another one that was common, and Allosaurus is another big example of a Saurischian. So again, these are all predators. Legs of dinosaurs were positioned directly under the body. Why? You see the legs directly underneath the body because they have so much weight. So this allows them to have more weight bearing. So they got to be a lot bigger because of that. Whereas you look at the legs of, say, lizards or alligators, the legs are off to the side. So they can't get quite as heavy on the land. In the water they can get pretty heavy, like your alligators and crocodiles, because you have that buoyancy. But on the land you have to have more support, so the leg bones are positioned directly underneath the body to allow for speed of these giant animals. Of course, the KT event wiped the dinosaurs out 65 million years ago. What about the transition from reptile to birds. Well, we have some evidence that reptiles then evolved into birds. So guys, if y'all been listening here, we went from fish to amphibian, amphibian to reptile. Now we're going from reptile to bird. We also believe reptiles probably evolved into mammals as well. So most biologists would say reptiles evolved in both birds and mammals. So Archaeopteryx lithographica would be one species. This is Archaeopteryx lithographica. It has both theropod traits, which would be, again, theropods are like your saurischians, like T-Rex. Theropods, again, would be your two-legged carnivores. And if you look down here, you can see it's got feathers, feathered wings and a tail, but it also has reptilian features like a long bony tail, claws on the wings, as you can see here, a very toothed beak, so there are actually teeth here in the beak, and then no large breastbone. So these guys could not fly. They were flightless since they didn't have those powerful breastbones. They were too heavy as well. Probably these feathers may have been there for courtship displays. May have been used to help them glide from tree to tree, but a lot of folks would say these feathers were used to impress mates, and then that may have led to flight eventually. So feathers may have not initially shown up for flight. They may have been just to show off, interestingly enough. Archaeopteryx lithographica, fossils of that have been found all around the world. They were originally discovered in a rock quarry in Germany in the 1800s. All right, moving on to Caudipteryx zui. Caudipteryx has, again, short bony tail like a reptile, claws and wings, tooth beak, no large breastbone, very much like Archaeopteryx, but has feathered wings and tails. So very similar between these two. And then finally we get to Confucianornis sanctus. Sanctus was much more bird-like. It had a completely feathered tail. There was no fleshy tail there, so no bony tail either, and no teeth in the beak at all, but they were flightless. Claws were still on the wings, and there was no large breastbone, which means they probably couldn't fly. Again, no muscle there. There was actually a modern bird that still lives today that has claws on the wings. It uses the claws on the wings to climb. I believe it's on a South Pacific island. I'll have to look up the name of that bird. So that's not extremely foreign. There are modern birds that still have claws on wings, but not many at all. Again, very isolated place there in the South Pacific, I believe is where that one is. So we could see these are possible transitional forms between reptiles and birds. So let's move on now to the birds, class aves. Let's talk about what they have to allow them to fly. First of all, obviously feathers. Feathers are the most distinguishing trait among class aves. All right, it's not even just flight. Feathers. No other group has feathers, so that makes this group special. These are modified scales that keep birds warm and enable flight. So we think that there were these structures called epidermal placodes that produced skin, and then the epidermal placodes with some small mutations resulted in hair for mammals and may have been mutated to result in feathers for birds. So epidermal placodes are very similar whether you're talking about a bird or a mammal or a reptile. So it may have been not huge mutations to result in feathers, hair, and just regular scales. Of course, the feathers are absolutely necessary to allow the bird to fly. They also keep the bird warm, especially your down feathers. Your contour feathers enable for flight. Those are the long, pretty feathers. But it's the down feathers that keep them warm. And air sacs. Air sacs are found in birds. This allows for very efficient breathing. How do they actually work? Well, when a bird takes a breath, the air goes into the lungs. Then the air goes from the lungs to the air sacs, and then the air sacs eventually go out of the body. And in fact, some birds, when they first take a breath, the air goes in the air sacs, then the lungs, then back to more air sacs. So what this does, it allows for air to be continually flowing through the lungs. You know how we breathe, the air goes in the lungs, hits a dead end, and then turns around. This creates what's called dead air in our lungs, which is not the most efficient thing. Just sort of stagnant air that's always present in the lungs. Even when you try to get all the air out of your lungs, there's still a little bit of air there. That's dead air. Well, the air sacs having continual flow of air This allows them to get a lot more oxygen, which allows them to take in more oxygen for flight. Flight requires very large amounts of oxygen. It's very intense, and they also fly at very high elevations when they migrate, especially. They fly at elevations of 37,000 feet. I think they found a buzzard that frequents areas around 36,000 feet. So you have to have very efficient breathing with that low pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. Reduction of organs. So we would have gotten down to just a single ovary. So no need to have two ovaries. We need to be as light as possible. Like if you guys have ever been on an airplane, you know that everything is smaller, right? The toilet's small, the seats are small, everything is just smaller in the airplane. Well, that's the idea. For flight, you've got to be light. So they have only a single ovary, no urinary bladder. So that explains why you see birds always just having almost no control over their bowels and constantly releasing feces and that white stuff. That white stuff is uric acid, very concentrated urea, and it just goes everywhere. If you ever have a pet bird, you can't just let them roam around the house. They'll they'll mess up everything with their wastes. And again, that's because they don't have a urinary bladder to hold it. Again, not having a urinary bladder, though, keeps them light. They also have a very thin skeleton. It's very thin, it's hollow, but it's also honeycomb, so it's strong. So it's lightweight but very strong. As we'll see, the honeycomb structure keeps them hollow but very, very powerful. And the sternum is to anchor flight muscles. They don't have any teeth. So the sternum is going to be modified into something called a keel. So we have this large bone that sticks straight off called the keel, which allows for flight muscles to attach. Very large flight muscles. So their pectoralis major muscles get huge. So birds have much more powerful pecs than humans because their sternum really sticks out into a keel, and that allows for them to have maybe 5 times the muscle mass in the chest compared to, say, a human. So they're very, very strong in the chest area. Hence the breast meat, right? Breast meat's a very large amount of meat. You can see here on slide 39, here's the structure of the wing. There's your contour feathers here. You could see the very delicate bones. Very much looks like some of the bones we see in a mammal's leg, because you have kind of like the equivalent of the humerus here, kind of like the radius and the ulna, like carpals, and then you have the equivalent of fingers here. You can see the feather with the shaft and what's called the vein. If you zoom in on the vein, you see there are barbs and barbules and hooks. So feathers are kind of like Velcro. You can actually rip the barbs away from each other and then zip them back up again like Velcro, because the hooks can reattach. So the barb then branches off to barbules and then hooks kind of attach everything together. The shaft is very lightweight and hollow. Here's a good example of the honeycomb structure of the inside of a pelican bone. Very lightweight but very strong as well. So all these things allow them to fly. Not to mention, folks, the sensory structures that allow for flight. I didn't mention this, but they have incredible vision. They typically see in color. They have vision that far exceeds ours. Like a hawk can see a mouse over 200 yards away walking around in a field. So you can see a mouse, tiny mouse, walking around a field of good 200 yards, 2 football fields away, or even further in some cases. Some of them can even see in the UV spectrum. Notice their beaks are modified for different foods. So the cracking beak is a very heavy beak, so that's used to break open nuts with thick shells. Scooping beak, like we see in pelicans, to get fish and marine life inside. A tearing beak to tear through flesh, like we see in the birds of prey. Probing beaks to get down into the sand and probe, like in the sandpiper, to probe for invertebrates in the sand. Nectar-feeding beaks in hummingbirds, and the spoonbill, which is a sieving beak, which removes plankton and other small invertebrates from the estuary. So amazing variety in our beaks here. Here are some of your different groups, guys. So we break down the orders. You could see passeriforms. These are your perching birds. Guys, most of the birds you see outside are passeriforms. So robins, blue jays, mockingbirds, crows, you name it, it's probably in that group. Crows are in a family called Corvidae, but that's all within this order, Passeriforms. Apodiforms means without feet. Actually, they do have feet, but they're really small. Those are basically your hummingbirds. Piciforms are your woodpeckers. So like the red cockaded woodpecker, which is an endangered species. The pileated, which is the large woodpecker in this area. Psittaciforms, that's your parrots, parakeets, etc. These birds are really important in the pet industry and can be very expensive. Also live really long lives of close to 100 years. Chedratiforms, these are your seabirds. Columbiforms, like your doves, pigeons, etc. In fact, pigeons are just a rock dove, really. Galliforms, which include a lot of your domestic species like chicken and turkey, which are very important for our food, extremely important for our food industry. Think about your case farms, right? Accipitriforms, this is a new group that just sort of popped up here in the third edition. You don't see a lot of diversity with that group, but they are basically the eagles, hawks, and vultures. This used to be called falconiforms. So falconiforms, which are your birds of prey, are now we're calling accipitriforms. I don't know. Let's see. This is a real new word for me, guys. Again, these used to be called falconiforms. That was a lot easier to say. So it looks like accipitriforms. Accipitriform. Anyway, got to work on that one. Wow, that's a new word for me, guys. Anyway, caraciforms. You can see these guys have very large beaks for breaking, like things like large nuts, etc. Kind of like what we saw with the with the parrots, hornbills, and we also have kingfishers in this group. Kingfishers do live in this area along rivers. You see them all the time in this area. Stratiforms, your owls, your nocturnal birds, which have very silent feathers, modified contour feathers for silent flight, very large eyes to take in any light they can. Really neat there. And seriforms, these are your ducks, geese, swans, large migrations, long necks, rather large birds. Pelicaniforms, again, your pelicans, and then sphenisciforms, that would be your penguins. So, guys, you can see your different orders. You may be asked about some of these orders on the test, so just know their general characteristics. Here's a good summary here, table 34-2. You may want to look at that a little bit more. And lastly, let's look at a few more traits. Birds also have warm body temperatures. Their body temperatures, guys, are usually about 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. So if you ever take your bird's body temperature, don't freak out. They don't have a fever. They have to have a high body temperature. Does anybody know why? Well, having a high body temperature allows them to have a high metabolism, or high metabolism results in a warm body temperature, and you have to have that because of flight. You have to have a very high metabolism to provide the energy for flight. Double circulation with a 4-chambered heart that separates oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So they have a heart that's very efficient. Again, that's necessary for flight, for long migrations. Very incredible vision. Again, usually seeing colors. Carnivores in most cases because they have to have a high calorie diet, so they eat a lot of flesh, including insects. Eggs are brooded, so usually either the male or the female or both have to sit on the egg to keep those eggs warm. Very complex courtship behaviors. This ensures that mates are healthy. So the male has to usually do all kinds of acrobatic displays to impress the female enough for her to allow him to mate. They often mate for life, especially in the birds of prey, the falconiforms. The courtship displays can be anything from dances to showing off feathers like in the peacock, or even pounding their chest like we see in the ruffed grouse. And all these courtship displays make them vulnerable, but the ladies like it. So these males typically are the ones doing all the show. And that's one of the reasons you'll see males being so colorful to try and impress females. Females are drab because they sit on the eggs. They must blend in. 28 orders, 166 families, 9,600 species. Very successful group, the birds, thanks to their ability to fly. Although there are some flightless birds, and the group is still not quite as diverse as the fish. So they're definitely not the most diverse group in the vertebrate subphylum. Okay, guys, we'll pick up on slide 44 later on. I want to show you a very short clip Oh, the physics of bird migration and flight.
So I came out here with a friend of mine today to watch migrating birds moving north from their winter grounds. And it turns out that some of these birds out here have moved for thousands of miles. And they do this every year. So it makes you wonder a little bit, though, how can they do this and how can they come back to the same location every year? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of physics involved in this. The distances these animals cover twice a year are pretty mind-blowing, so it makes sense that they have evolved many adaptations to help them in these migrations. Let's take a look at a couple of these. Let's start with why some birds fly in a V formation. To understand why they do this, we should first look at how a wing works. A wing generates lift because there's a pressure difference between the upper side and the underside of the wing. But at the tip of the wing, the higher pressure region on the underside kind of curls around to the lower pressure region of the upper side. And this creates kind of like a spiral called a wingtip vortex. And as it spirals around, it actually pushes down on the force of the lift. So it's kind of like a negative force in the sense of flight. And it's called a downwash. This is when the V formation is really beneficial. You see, just outside of the wingtip, the vortex also generates an upwash. So a bird following behind and just outside of the flight path of another bird can use that upwash to get free lift. And this makes a huge difference in energy consumption during long-distance migrations. So pretty sweet, unless you are at the points of the V. Next, how they navigate. So we use a compass in order to know where we're heading. But for birds, that compass is kind of built into their cells. And if that sounds complicated, it actually gets worse. Experiments done on the European robin show that these birds orient themselves only under specific colors of light, and that certain radio wavelengths can totally mess up their sense of direction. And this is not how a regular compass works. The scientists believe that the birds use some kind of quantum mechanics in order to orient themselves. And this is really advanced stuff. To put it in simple terms, they think that the bird's eyes work similar to the digital display that pilots have, giving the birds the ability to see Earth's magnetic field. I know, totally crazy. And I apologize if I really confused you, but I just think this is awesome. And last, eating during the migration. I'm taking the ruby-throated hummingbird as an example here. This guy has the Gulf of Mexico in his migrational path. This trip takes close to 22 hours. This is crazy for a little bird like that. Hummingbirds are small and they have a huge energy consumption because of the way they fly. And now they have to stock up on 25 to 40% body fat before they do the crossing. That's a lot of extra weight to carry for a little guy like that, and then have to fly for another 22 hours. So that's it. Some interesting facts around physics of migration.
Really neat, guys. So the Arctic tern is a bird that migrates from the South Pole to the North Pole every year. Wow. And pulls it off thanks to the amazing physics there. A great four-chambered heart, very efficient body plan. All right, guys. Well, if you have any questions for me, just email me at mspath@wpcc.edu or simply bring your questions to class where I will see you next.